Look at the world around you, the city you live in, the language you speak, the wars that were fought and the ones that were not, the technology in your pocket, the freedoms you exercise, the debts you owe. We take all of it for granted, as if it were baked into the very laws of physics, but it isn't. We are taught that history is a river, flowing inevitably toward the sea. But the past is not a river. It is a spiderweb of fragile threads, a single gust of wind, a single decision, a single life, cut short or extended by a matter of hours. These are the hinges upon which the future swings, and we are always standing on the edge of the door that didn't open. This channel is called Time's Divergence Point, Times, because that is what we investigate, those exact moments where the past split into two distinct futures, the moment a general gave an order, the moment a storm changed course, the moment an assassin missed, or a soldier flinched, or a treaty was signed or never signed. In every investigation we undertake, we will ask one question that haunts the entire project. What if that moment had gone differently? Welcome to the Time's Divergence Point. The investigation begins now. The year is 1405. The horizon off the coast of Nanjing is not a line of sky and sea, but a wall of timber and canvas. The Yongle Emperor stands on the stone embankment, his gaze fixed on the gargantuan fleet bobbing in the harbor. Hundreds of ships, their hulls rising like mountains from the silt, groan under the rhythmic pull of the tide. The salt air carries the scent of wet rope, fresh pine, and the damp, metallic tang of the river. Every sailor is at his post. Every sail is furled, waiting for a single word to break the stillness. This is the zenith of power, a gathering of resources so vast it threatens to tilt the earth itself. Behind the emperor, the imperial court waits in rigid silence, their eyes fixed on the admiral, Zheng He, who stands at the edge of the pier. The wind shifts, tugging at the flags that snap like whips against the heavy, humid air. History is holding its breath. The ships are built for the open ocean, designed to map the world and command the distant tides. But the emperor does not look toward the sea. He looks inland, toward the dust-choked trails that lead to the setting sun. The emperor turned, his movement slow and deliberate. He gestured not toward the open water, but toward the dusty, winding paths of the interior. Zheng He stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, expecting orders for the southern seas. Instead, he received a scroll sealed with the imperial wax. The command was absolute. The fleet would not sail. The ships were to be anchored and stripped of their primary gear to serve as stationary defenses along the riverbanks. The real mission lay inland. The admiral read the text, his eyes scanning the ink that dismantled his life's work. He looked back at the harbor, where the massive vessels sat idle, their hulls reflecting the gray morning light. The order was clear: fortify the overland routes, link the Pacific to the Mediterranean with iron and stone. It was a reversal of every expectation, a pivot that tore the map of the world in two. The admiral bowed low, his forehead touching the cold stone of the pier. When he rose, the maritime era had ended. The era of the silk net had begun. Soldiers started moving, not toward the gangplanks, but toward the mountains, carrying the weight of a new empire on their backs. The logistics of an empire shifted in a single afternoon. Thousands of laborers, once destined to crew the great ships, now found themselves hauling heavy stone and timber toward the western mountain passes. They worked in rhythmic shifts, the sound of chisels striking rock replacing the creak of masts and rigging. Zheng He stood at the center of the frantic mobilization, coordinating supply lines that stretched deep into the heart of the Gobi. The vision was a single, unbroken thread of commerce spanning the breadth of the known world. It required more than just paths. It demanded fortresses at every crossroads and wells at every desert station. The admiral moved between the camps, mapping the terrain not for naval navigation, but for the steady, relentless flow of caravans. Each soldier and engineer understood the scope of the task: to turn the chaotic, splintered trails of the interior into a paved, secure artery of power. As the first watchtowers rose against the horizon, the separation between the Pacific coast and the Mediterranean began to dissolve. The map was no longer a collection of distant, isolated regions. It was becoming a coherent, singular machine, fueled by the ambition of an emperor who dared to redefine the boundaries of geography itself. By the year 1450, the landscape had been irrevocably altered. A chain of fortified stone structures stretched across the vast interior, each one a fortress designed to anchor the flow of goods. These were the caravanserais, spaced with mathematical precision, appearing at every day's journey along the route. When a violent sandstorm tore through the western desert, the caravans did not scatter. They retreated into the heavy timber gates of the nearest hub, the walls holding firm against the wind, while the interior remained quiet and orderly. The architecture worked. It was a victory of engineering over the chaos of the natural world. From the high mountain passes to the flat, scorched basins, these nodes of security multiplied, connecting disparate regions into a single, seamless corridor. Watchmen stood on the ramparts, their signal fires flickering in perfect, timed sequences that relayed messages across hundreds of miles in hours. The scale of the transformation was absolute. Where once only fragmented trails existed, a permanent, protected spine of stone now cut through the wilderness. The dust of the past settled, revealing a continent bound by the cold, efficient geometry of the new order. Progress was no longer a slow crawl. It was a rhythmic, relentless advance across the map. The stone walls were merely the skeleton. The Silk Road Concord became the beating heart. By the mid-15th century, the barriers that had long kept civilizations apart, tolls, arbitrary borders, and conflicting laws dissolved. A merchant starting in Samarkand with a ledger of spice and silk could now carry a single, standardized seal that guaranteed passage all the way to the docks of Venice. The signing of the Concord took place in a neutral hub where emissaries from the Ming Court and the Mediterranean city-states sat at a table to codify the new reality. They spoke in different tongues, but they calculated in the same currency. Feudal tribute vanished, replaced by a streamlined, predictable system of credit and contract. The result was a sudden, expansive openness. Caravans moved with the confidence of local travel, knowing that every 1,000 miles would bring the same secure gates and the same established protection. Distant markets were no longer mysterious, unreachable lands. They were simply next on the route. The atmosphere across the continent shifted from suspicion to cooperation. Walls that once kept enemies out now held the promise of shared profit. For the first time in history, the vast distance between the Pacific and the Mediterranean felt small, bridged by a singular, persistent pulse of trade that refused to break. Dr. Aria Vance stands in the center of the reconstruction, her boots clicking against the polished stone floor. The room is a replica of a mid-15th century hub designed to mirror the exact proportions of the original Samarkand outposts. She moves toward a central display case, her eyes tracking the precise arrangement of the exhibits. She reaches out, her fingertips tracing the edge of a heavy leather-bound ledger kept behind glass. The spine is cracked, the hide worn smooth by decades of handling. These are not merely artifacts. They are the blueprints of a unified world. She points to a series of entries, the ink faded, but the numbers unmistakable. Each row represents a transaction that bypassed local lords, favoring the efficiency of the new trade network. As she turns a page, The weight of the paper is evident, a physical testament to the bureaucracy that replaced the chaotic tribute of the past. There is a small smudge of charcoal near the margin, a human error in a system of perfect math. It is a quiet moment, a bridge between the present and the past. She pulls her hand back, the silence of the room amplifying the weight of the objects on display. Here, in the stillness of the reconstruction, the scale of the transformation becomes impossible to ignore. The ledger was not just a tool, it was an executioner for the old ways. Where once a lord demanded a portion of the harvest, he now received a calculated credit transfer. The shift was absolute. Local power structures, built on centuries of hereditary loyalty and feudal tribute, fractured under the weight of the new Concord. Merchants arrived with standardized contracts, backed by the authority of the Silk Road Network, turning regional strongmen into mere administrators of the trade route. The viewer sees the transformation in the records. Gold replaced grain, and interest superseded fealty. It was a cold, mathematical erasure of the feudal past. The landscape changed as fortresses became warehouses, and the chaotic unpredictability of local taxes gave way to the rigid, predictable rhythms of global commerce. There was no room for the impulsive whims of a petty ruler when the entire continent ran on a unified balance sheet. By the mid-15th century, the old blood ties were severed, replaced by the invisible, unbreakable chains of contract law. Everything was categorized, weighed, and tallied. The world had become a vast, efficient machine, stripped of the messy, personal politics that had defined it for generations. This was the birth of a managed prosperity, where survival depended not on who one knew, but on the accuracy of the ledger. Deep in the heart of Samarkand, the air is thick with the sharp scent of linseed oil and metal. A heavy, iron-framed press dominates the center of the shop, its rhythmic thud echoing against the stone walls. This is where the information revolution finds its engine, 400 years ahead of its time. The master printer pulls a lever, and the press descends, stamping a single page with Latin, Persian, and Chinese characters in one fluid motion. He lifts the frame, and the paper is peeled away, revealing a crisp, uniform block of text that defies the limitations of distance. 3 languages, 1 message, perfectly replicated. The printer leans in, squinting at the ink density, his thumb brushing over the wet surface to ensure the characters remain sharp. He nods and stacks the sheet onto a growing pile. Beside him, shelves are lined with thousands of identical pages, ready for the caravans. There is no waiting for scribes, no risk of transcription error, and no scarcity of knowledge. The machine does not tire, and it does not forget. As the press cycles again, the sound of metal meeting paper fills the room, a heartbeat of a new, hyper-connected world. It is a moment of intellectual vertigo, where the past is suddenly stripped of its slow, deliberate pace and replaced by the relentless, humming efficiency of the modern age. Knowledge flowed outward from the Samarkand hub like a rising tide, unimpeded by the ancient barriers of geography or class. The printed pages traveled along the fortified trade routes, finding their way into the hands of scholars, merchants, and even the common laborers who maintained the caravanserais. Where once a book was a rare treasure guarded in locked monastic libraries, now it was a common commodity, carried in the saddlebags of every traveler. In the markets of Venice, a trader could read the same navigational charts as his counterpart in the Ming ports. The democratization of information shattered the old monopolies on truth. Universities in Damascus and Paris began to exchange curricula, their debates synchronized by the constant arrival of new pamphlets. A sense of global enlightenment took hold, as if the entire continent had suddenly woken from a long, localized slumber. Intellectual discoveries were no longer isolated sparks. They were shared fires that spread from city to city, igniting a rapid, cross-cultural evolution. Mathematics, engineering, and philosophy were debated in the public squares, translated into multiple tongues, and refined by thousands of minds working in unison. The world felt smaller, more transparent, and infinitely more capable. Every border became a permeable membrane, allowing ideas to drift across the horizon, weaving a new, unified tapestry of human thought that spanned the entire known world. The tide of knowledge reached its high water mark, but the currents beneath were already changing. Along the vast, stone-paved routes connecting the Pacific to the Mediterranean, the rhythm of trade began to tighten. Where once hundreds of independent merchants jockeyed for space at the caravanserais, now the ledger systems favored the massive, synchronized convoys. Smaller operators found their access restricted, their routes redirected, and their cargo subject to new, standardized tariffs that only the largest syndicates could absorb. The open road, once a symbol of boundless opportunity, became a series of controlled checkpoints. Men, in counting houses, far from the dust of the trail, began to dictate the flow of goods with a stroke of a quill. They did not need to own the land, they owned the logistics. The ledger books, which had once democratized information, now served to track the movement of every bale of silk and every crate of spice, funneling the wealth into fewer, more concentrated channels. The atmosphere in the trade hubs grew quiet, stripped of the chaotic, vibrant bartering of the past. In its place, a rigid, systematic order took root. The connections remained, but the autonomy of the individual merchant began to wither under the weight of a growing, invisible hierarchy that governed the world from behind locked doors. By the decade's end, the concept of a free market had become a historical curiosity. The caravanserais, once communal shelters for the weary, were now branded assets of the syndicate. Every mile of the stone road carried a toll, and every toll fed the vaults of the merchant oligarchy. Independent traders who arrived at the gates were no longer met with open trade, but with rigid, non-negotiable contracts. One merchant from Bukhara stood before the heavy iron gates of a hub, his ledger showing a loss for the third straight month. He offered a portion of his silk to pay the passage, but the gatekeeper did not look at the silk. He pointed to a printed mandate on the wall, entry reserved for priority corporate cargo. The merchant turned away. His caravan stalled in the dust, while a massive, synchronized convoy of the syndicate passed him by without a glance. The world had become a closed system. Power was no longer held by emperors or kings, but by the men who updated the ledgers. They sat in climate-controlled rooms in Samarkand, managing the flow of lifeblood across the map as if moving pieces on a board. The air in the hubs felt thin, pressurized by the constant, silent movement of wealth that no longer belonged to the people who moved it. It was a perfectly managed machine, and the average citizen was merely a gear, replaceable and silent. Professor Marcus Thorne tapped a glass display, pulling up the archival logs from the winter of 1520. While the early quarantine protocols had successfully strangled the Black Death in its infancy, they had created a false sense of security. The network was too efficient to remain safe. It began in the crowded docks of Guangzhou and reached the markets of Samarkand in less than 3 weeks. A courier, eyes bloodshot and skin flushed, collapsed while handing over a manifest at the gate. By the time the guards reached him, the respiratory symptoms had already manifested in those standing nearby. This was not the slow creep of a medieval plague. It was a firestorm moving along the trade routes at the speed of a galloping horse. Within days, the same aggressive strain of influenza appeared in Venice, Damascus, and Cairo. The very infrastructure designed for the rapid transit of goods became the primary vector for the invisible intruder. Quarantine bells rang in every major hub, but the system of interconnected caravanserais was already compromised. Every ledger exchange, every handshake, and every shared canteen became a transmission point. The efficiency of the global machine, once the pride of the merchant lords, now guaranteed that no corner of the map remained isolated. The silence of the trade hubs was broken by the sound of coughing and the frantic thud of gates being bolted shut from the inside. The irony was absolute. The massive, interconnected machine built to sustain the world now served as its most efficient executioner. In the northern hubs, the death toll climbed, yet the convoys never slowed. Merchants watched from elevated walkways as infected laborers were dragged from the loading bays, replaced immediately by fresh hands from the surrounding camps. The protocol was simple. The network must function. If a hub became a graveyard, it was merely scrubbed and restocked. A gatekeeper in Samarkand stood at his post, clutching a damp cloth to his face. He watched a line of wagons carrying medical supplies bypass the village entirely, heading straight for the aristocratic estates in the capital. The cargo was marked for the elite, while the common trade routes were left to choke. There was no attempt to cure the masses, only to contain the disruption to the supply chain. The influenza thrived on the very proximity that defined the Silk Net. Every mile of road, every shared canteen, and every port became a conduit for the pathogen to reach the next population center. By mid-year, the casualty reports were no longer being read. They were being filed as operational losses. The world had achieved perfect connectivity, and in doing so, it had paved a frictionless path for its own decline. The horizon did not bring the smoke of burning villages or the thunder of cannons. When the joint Ming-Ottoman fleet dropped anchor, the silence on the shore was profound. Massive, multi-masted vessels stood in the bay, their hulls stained by thousands of miles of travel. A single longboat detached from the lead ship, moving toward the beach with rhythmic, disciplined oars. The local warriors stood ready, spears braced, waiting for a charge that never came. Instead, the emissaries stepped onto the sand with empty hands. They carried no weapons. They carried scrolls, thick with wax seals and intricate calligraphy. A lead diplomat approached the village elder, bowing with practiced precision. He did not ask for gold or land. He offered a partnership. He unrolled a document, the parchment heavy and dry, detailing shipping routes and resource extraction quotas. It was a contract, framed in the language of mutual benefit and sovereign alliance. The elder looked from the scroll to the ships, confused by this strange, calculated intrusion. This was not a war of conquest. It was the arrival of a global market. The emissaries waited, patient as stone, while the ink on the contract dried in the coastal wind. They were not here to destroy the world. They were here to map it into the ledger. The elder traced the ink with a trembling finger, struggling to reconcile the reality of his people with the cold precision of the scroll. These were not conquerors, but accountants. Within weeks, the transformation began. The sacred groves were not burned. They were surveyed, partitioned, and assigned a market value. Traditional weaving houses were dismantled, the looms replaced by standardized workshops designed for export volume. The indigenous leaders remained in their seats, but their authority was now tethered to the ledger. They became middle managers in a game they did not invent. A young potter, once proud of his unique regional style, was instructed to mirror the mass-produced ceramics arriving from the Ming workshops. He watched his kiln go cold, the clay repurposed for crates destined for the Mediterranean. Every local custom, every ritual, was analyzed for its potential impact on productivity. What could be commodified was kept. What could not was discarded as inefficiency. The landscape itself shifted. Paths, once used for sacred pilgrimages, were widened into trade arteries, leveled by teams of laborers under the watchful eye of the Concord. The culture was preserved in form, but hollowed out in function. It was a slow, quiet drowning in a sea of ink and parchment, where every soul was a line item and every history was merely a variable in the grand calculation of global trade. By the dawn of 1700, the experiment had finalized. The world was no longer a collection of lands, but a single, synchronized machine. From the ports of the Pacific to the markets of the Mediterranean, every gear turned in perfect alignment. There was no room for error, no space for the spontaneous. The pulse of the globe was measured in shipping logs and ledger balances, ticking with the relentless consistency of a clock. Every morning, millions of workers rose to the same standardized schedules, their lives governed by the requirements of the Concord. Even the concept of time itself had been flattened, synchronized across meridians to ensure the flow of capital never stuttered. It was an awe-inspiring achievement of logistics, a triumph of human engineering that spanned continents without a single break in the chain. Yet, in this immense humming mechanism, there was a terrifying stillness. No local crisis could ripple outward without being instantly dampened by the system. No rebellion could gather strength before it was balanced out by economic adjustment. The world moved with the smoothness of polished glass, reflecting only the calculations of the merchant oligarchy. It was a masterpiece of order, a triumph of managed stability, where the wild, humanity's pulse stilled. Cold gears churned ceaselessly. The map of the world began to bleed its colors away. Borders that had been carved by centuries of war and treaty simply dissolved under the pressure of the new economic order. There were no more nations, no more flags to rally under, no more anthems to sing. In their place, the globe was partitioned into massive, contract-based city-states. A man was no longer a subject of a crown or a citizen of a republic. He was an asset, a resident of a hub, tied to the city by the legal weight of his employment contract. The transition was not marked by fire or revolution, but by a quiet, administrative erasure. Public squares that once hosted parades for fallen soldiers were repurposed as logistics centers. Statues of national heroes were hauled down, melted, and recast into standardized numbering plaques for the new districts. The very concept of loyalty shifted from the homeland to the ledger. People looked at their neighbors and saw not countrymen, but fellow stakeholders in a sprawling, faceless enterprise. The world was undeniably efficient, safe, and perfectly functioning, but the change left a hollow space where a collective identity should have been. It was a world without a heart, a vast expanse of humanity functioning in isolation, connected by paper, yet drifting in a sea of profound, mechanical indifference. The drums of war fell silent, not because humanity had outgrown conflict, but because the cost of territorial conquest had become inefficient. Armies were dismantled, their ranks absorbed into the logistics pipelines of the great cartels. In place of the battlefield, the new front lines were etched into market fluctuations and supply chain dominance. Competition did not vanish. It moved into the shadows of the boardroom. Three major cartels now held the global flow of resources in a stranglehold, their influence felt in every transaction. One group controlled the grain, another the spice and textiles, and the third the movement of information itself. When a city-state dared to challenge a trade quota, there were no invading fleets. Instead, the lights simply dimmed as fuel shipments were redirected, and the shelves grew bare as supply lines were pinched. This was the peace of the ledger, a silent, cold strangulation. It was a world where aggression was expressed through the deliberate tightening of a contract, where the most lethal weapon was a signature on a trade agreement. The peace was absolute, yet it felt predatory. Every citizen lived in the comfort of a managed life, unaware that they were merely pawns in a long-standing, bloodless war of margins and market shares. The silence of the streets was not the peace of harmony, but the quiet of a cage. I stand in the center of the grand hub, the heartbeat of this global machine. Thousands of people pass by, their movements precise and fluid. They walk in lanes, they pause at terminals, they exchange goods with nod-based efficiency. But there is no laughter, there is no shouting, no one bumps into another by accident, and no one stops to argue or linger. The silence is profound, a heavy blanket that smothers the air. I watch a young man drop a document. He does not curse. He retrieves it in one smooth, practiced motion and continues his path without breaking stride. It is too perfect. It is the silence of a clockwork mechanism where every gear has been polished to remove even the slightest friction. I reach out to touch a stone pillar, expecting the grit of history, but the surface is smooth, cool, and sterile. This is not the peace of a settled heart. It is the stillness of a museum display where the exhibits have been trained to mimic life. Every interaction feels calculated, every reaction anticipated by a system that knows the outcome before the action is even taken. It is eerie, this absence of the unpredictable. The air feels thin, drained of the chaotic, beautiful spark that defines the human experience. I am surrounded by safety, yet I feel like a ghost haunting a tomb of total order. I trace the timeline on the wall, looking for the jagged edges of history. They are gone. There was no American Revolution to break the chains of distant masters. There was no Enlightenment to demand that power reside in the individual. The great, explosive fights for human rights never ignited because the system provided everything before a grievance could even form. No one rose up because no one had a reason to hunger for change. It hits me with the force of a physical blow. We traded the terrifying possibility of chaos for the absolute safety of a managed existence. Every rebellion, every protest, every scream for freedom has been filtered out of our collective memory. We are prosperous, we are fed, and we are perfectly secure, but we are also empty. The sovereign individual, that dangerous and beautiful spark that once defined us, was never allowed to flicker into life. We chose the cage because it was warm and quiet. I look at my own hands, steady and uncalloused by the struggle for self-determination. The cost of this peace is not measured in gold or trade quotas, but in the slow, quiet extinction of the human spirit. We are living in a masterpiece of order, and yet the realization tastes like ash in my mouth. We are safe, and that is our tragedy. I turn my back on the map of the Silk Net. The glowing lines of trade routes and city-states pulse on the wall, a masterpiece of connectivity that spans the globe. Yet it looks like a web of cold, unmoving light. I walk toward the exit, my boots clicking against the polished floor with a sound that feels unnervingly loud. The air here is filtered, scrubbed of all dust and scent, just like the history we have curated. I stop at the glass doors and look at my reflection. There is no fire in my eyes, no shadow of a struggle, only the calm, predictable surface of a person who has never needed to fight for a single inch of existence. The weight of it settles into my shoulders. It is a crushing, quiet burden to know that we have traded the chaotic, beautiful mess of our potential for this gilded cage. I place my hand against the cold surface of the door, feeling the vibration of the city-state humming beneath me. It is efficient, it is flawless, and it is entirely, devastatingly hollow. I push the door open, stepping out of the light of the map and into the dim, artificial twilight of the corridor, leaving the perfect world behind me as I carry the heavy price of our peace. I walk down the corridor, passing rows of silent, climate-controlled archives. Everything here is measured, categorized, and devoid of risk. Yet, my mind drifts to the versions of us that never came to be. I think of the revolutions that were never fought, the borders that were never contested, and the blood that was never spilled in the name of liberty. We chose a different path in our reality. We chose the fractures. We chose the mess. I stop by a window overlooking the city, watching the rhythmic flow of traffic below. It is perfectly synchronized, a clockwork machine of commerce. But beneath that order, I feel a sudden sharp ache for the noise of the world I know. I think of our history, the wars, the failed uprisings, the desperate, uncoordinated cries for justice. It was bloody and it was brutal, but it was ours. I find myself standing taller, a strange, quiet pride rising in my chest. We were never safe, we were never perfectly managed, and we were often wrong. But in that chaos, we were undeniably, recklessly alive. I look out at the horizon, no longer mourning the peace we sacrificed, but instead honoring the beautiful, jagged wreckage of the world we actually built. I trace the outline of the city grid on the glass, but my eyes aren't seeing the commerce anymore. They are seeing the friction. It hits me with the force of a physical blow. The sovereign individual was never a given. It was an accident of our agony. Every time we stood against a king, every time we bled for a border, every time we screamed for a right that didn't exist, we were carving out the edges of our own souls. In this perfect, managed world, there is no need for a self because there is no conflict to define it. We are parts of a machine, replaceable and smooth. But back there, in the blood-soaked pages of our real history, the struggle forced us to become singular. We had to be individuals to survive the chaos. The realization brings a sudden, chilling clarity. We didn't just endure our fractured past, we grew from it. The sovereign I, this ability to stand apart, to dissent, to choose, is the direct descendant of every failed rebellion and every hard-won freedom. It was not a gift from the state. It was a weapon we forged in the dark. And now, in the silence of this controlled peace, I finally understand why the cost was so high. We were buying our own humanity. I turn away from the glass and look back at the map of the silk net hanging in the center of the room. It glows with a soft, steady light, tracing the arteries of a world that never knew a revolution. But as I study those lines, they begin to shimmer, overlapping with the borders of the world I remember. The silk net never truly vanished. It remains a ghost, drifting beneath the surface of every map we draw today. I walk to the center of the display and run my hand over the projected trade routes. They feel cold, yet they pulse with a phantom rhythm. I see the invisible weight of these connections pressing against our national identities, whispering that the world is still being managed from the shadows. It is a haunting sensation, like walking through a house that feels familiar but is not your home. These ancient roots are not just lines on a screen. They are the architecture of our modern constraints. They haunt our borders, dictating the flow of power and the limits of our reach. We have built a world of glass and steel, but the ghost of the net still breathes through the cracks, reminding us that progress is never a straight line, but a heavy shadow that follows us everywhere we go. The light of the map dims until only the thin, glowing veins of the silk net remain, pulsating in the dark. I watch them beat like a slow, artificial heart. Everything is accounted for. Every trade, every city-state, every life is mapped within this ledger of perfect security. There is no hunger, no war, no chaotic rupture of the status quo, but there is also no room for the unplanned, no space for the discordant voice that changes the world. I reach out and touch the center of the display, watching the light scatter under my fingertips. We have traded our friction for this silence, and in our pursuit of total stability, we have muffled the very things that make us human. Progress was never meant to be a destination of absolute safety. It is a trade-off. We have chosen the collective's comfort over the dangerous, necessary fire of the individual soul. I pull my hand away, and the room goes dark. Outside, the world remains perfectly managed, yet the ghost of the road lingers in the silence. It is a reminder that we are the sum of our blood, our errors, and our rebellion. Without the risk of falling, we have forgotten how to climb. The trade is complete, the map is finished, and now we are finally left alone with the quiet weight of what we have lost.